Welcome to another entry into the build overview series and the first video in this series for patch 3.25. In this one we're going to be taking a look at Garartha's Gladiator build, which he league started in Hardcore Trade League for Settlers of Kalguur. This is a melee bleed build using one of the new abilities added in patch 3.25, Eviscerate. In fact, this build utilises a bunch of new mechanics that are introduced to the game in this league, which is a big reason why I wanted to cover it, but more so than any other reason, this is just a really awesome build with a refreshing playstyle using the new Retaliate skills. So let's head over to the path of building for Garartha's Gladiator. The version of the build we're looking at here is the one Garartha was using to farm Simulacrum. And of course you can modify the setup a bit to do other content, for example speccing out of bleed pops and into War of Attrition for bossing. But for the purpose of this video, I wanted to look at this version of the build in particular because I think it showcases its strengths very well. So let's begin with the basis of the build, Eviscerate. This ability was added in 3.25 as one of the new Retaliation skills. The skill has a noticeably large attack damage effectiveness and it always inflicts bleeding. But being a Retaliation skill, it has a special mechanic that sets it apart from other skills. Retaliation skills can only be used once a specific condition is met. For Eviscerate, that requires you to block, and once you've blocked you then have a window of time to use the skill, and upon using it, it goes on cooldown. Garartha is using the Gladiator Ascendancy specifically for its specialization into Retaliation skills, with the Measured Retaliation notable. This node doubles the base duration window that you have to use the skill once the condition has been met. But more importantly than that, it makes it so that 50% of the time on using a Retaliation skill, it will not go on cooldown and instead remain usable so that you can use it again immediately. Garartha is also anointing a new anoint-only notable passive skill on his amulet, No Forgiveness, which provides a further 20% of the same modifier, for a total 70% chance that the skill won't go on cooldown upon use and will remain usable. On top of this, Garartha is also making use of a new support gem, Expert Retaliation, which provides a large amount of more cooldown recovery rate to ensure that even when that 30% chance is rolled that the skill does go on cooldown, it's not on cooldown for long before it's back up and ready again. Now, you may be thinking that this is not necessary since it's a bleed build. Once it inflicts bleed, it has good damage uptime. However, like many bleed builds in this patch, the build is also using Rizlatha's Coil and the physical mastery for more maximum attack damage, which massively widens the damage range for physical attacks. This means that when you hit the top end of that range, you'll be dealing a lot more damage with the resulting bleed, but in practice you're not always going to be hitting the top of the range. In fact, there will be a lot of times where you're hitting somewhere in the middle or even on the lower end, and this is where Measured Retaliation, No Forgiveness and Expert Retaliation come into play, because ensuring Eviscerate can be used as much as possible is an important factor in fishing for the strongest possible bleed. Bleeding deals damage over time based on the size of the hit that inflicted it, dealing a lot more damage if the target is also moving, but by default only one bleed will deal damage at a time, and this will always be the largest bleed. So by spamming Eviscerate, you can fish for the highest roll range of the hit, inflicting a large bleed, and once the big bleed is inflicted, you're then looking for an aggravated bleed proc. Aggravated bleed is another new mechanic in 3.25, which essentially makes it so that bleed deals its full damage as if the target was moving. When you proc aggravated bleeding on a target, all of the previously applied bleeds will now be aggravated, dealing full damage as if the target was moving for their remaining duration. Which is why Ailment duration is an important factor in a build like this, because once you've landed a top roll bleed, you then need time to aggravate that bleed before it then deals its full damage for the remaining duration. Garartha has a total of 45% chance to aggravate bleeding, 10% from bloodletting, 10% from the Vulnerability Curse quality stat, and 25% from an Eldritch Glove implicit. And by using Blade Storm to inflict Maim and provide Culling Strike, you can ensure that any bleed inflicted by Eviscerate is going to be aggravated very quickly to be able to deal its full damage output. On top of that, there's a huge 80% increased ailment duration for ailments inflicted by retaliation skills from the Retaliation Mastery. which PoB doesn't recognise, so we've added this stat directly in the config. Even with all of the faster ailment damage from Dirty Techniques wheel down here, this build is still able to achieve a 7-second bleed duration, making Rizlatha's Coil a much more reliable damage upgrade. The inflicted bleeds are dealing damage based on the hit that comes from this very well crafted Reaver axe, but I do want to just take a moment to mention Jack the Axe, which is a unique axe that Garatha was using for a long time before upgrading to this one. Jack the Axe has the Thirst for Blood ability, which reserves 10% of your life to provide 20% more bleeding damage. And this buff helps to keep it competitive with a decently crafted axe, at least until you get your hands on something like this Reaver axe here. Jack the Axe is certainly something to consider using in early progression for the build. So that's the main ability and the bleed mechanics, but that's not the full story for the offensive side of the build. As mentioned earlier, Bladestorm is linked to maim support to inflict maim and make targets take 10% increased physical damage as a result, which is additive with the 30% increased physical damage taken from the Vulnerability Curse. Garatha is also using Pride for a more physical damage taken aura applied to enemies standing nearby, which scales up to 40% more physical damage taken depending on how long they've been in the aura, and this aura also enables a 57% increased physical damage boost from a Watcher's Eye jewel mod. And speaking of that jewel, it also provides a few other powerful stats which we'll get to in just a moment. There's also the Blood Sap Tincture, which can provide a massive damage boost if it lines up with one of those high roll bleeds. And last but not least for the offense, the Light of Meaning unique jewel, which provides increased physical damage per passive skill in its radius, for a total 126% increased physical damage from just this jewel slot alone. Alright, let's move over to the defenses of the build, and let's begin with block. Garatha is using Determined Survivor. This Ascendancy Notable makes it so that your equipped shield provides 50% chance to block attacks rather than the amount of block presented by the shield itself, and when combined with a few wheels on the tree that provide a lot more chance to block attacks, the use of the Versatile Combatant keystone becomes very beneficial. This keystone makes it so that your overcapped attack block grants spell block at a ratio of 2% spell block per 1% attack block, which makes it so that you only need to invest into attack block to cap out both types of block. Maximum block chance is 75% by default, lowered to 65% by Versatile Combatant, which would be good considering the fairly low investment, but this is made far better by another Ascendancy Notable on the Gladiator, More Than Skill. This node makes your chance to block lucky as long as you've blocked in the last 4 seconds, and in an environment like Simulacrum, that's going to be pretty much all of the time. You can see that when enabling recent block, the block chance for the build jumps up, and this is because the calculation for block chance is now displaying the effective block chance, factoring in lucky block. This modifier rolls chance to block twice, choosing the favourable outcome. So for example, an incoming spell hit would need to roll the 35% chance to not be blocked, and then roll another 35% chance to not be blocked for it to actually hit you and deal its damage. This is why lucky block is so incredibly powerful, especially in an environment where there's a lot of enemies and a lot of incoming hits. Block is then put to use to provide even more benefit with the Shaper modifier on the shield, which grants 5% instant life recovery every time the character blocks. So next up in the defensive section is Spell Suppression, which is mostly obtained from the affixes on the shield, helmet, body armor, gloves, and boot slots. But the chance to suppress spell damage is capped out with the use of a cluster jewel down here for Elegant Form. With capped spell suppression, any spell hit which does make it through that spell block has its damage lessened by 50%. But the Elegant Form Notable has a bit more use than just capping out spell suppression chance, because it also helps the build to reach 100% chance to avoid elemental ailments, with a further 20% coming from the shield mastery here, and the remaining 60% coming from the boots. Elemental ailment avoidance is an important defensive layer generally, but it's especially important for Delirium where you encounter a lot of dangerous ailments. Alright, let's discuss damage type specific mitigation, beginning with elemental damage. This build is able to achieve a very high amount of maximum elemental resistances, which comes in part from the passive skill tree. Soul of Steel is being taken, along with the Armor Mastery, Prismatic Skin, Barbarism, and a new cluster in 3.25, Nomadic Teachings. The rest of the maximum elemental resistances are coming from another new thing in 3.25, Dual Modifiers. 2% maximum cold resistance up here, 2% maximum lightning resistance here, and 2% to both cold and lightning resistance down here. There's also 2% maximum fire resistance on the crafted shield, and together, all of these modifiers come together to massively improve elemental damage mitigation. But that's not all, because in 3.25, endurance charges were changed to provide elemental damage reduction instead of elemental resistances, and Goratha is investing heavily into maximum endurance charges, picking up 3 on the passive skill tree for a total of 6 maximum charges. These charges are generated using Enduring Cry and with the Eldritch Body Armor implicit, which grants a charge every 11 seconds. So as long as a rare monster isn't encountered which strips those charges away, they provide 4% elemental damage reduction each for a total 24% elemental damage reduction, which is multiplicative with the mitigation provided by resistance, further improving mitigation again against elemental damage. But that's not the only purpose of the endurance charges in this build, because they also help to massively boost physical damage mitigation as well, so let's discuss the build's defenses against physical damage. Firstly, Goratha has a total of 18% of physical hit damage taken as fire damage, which comes from the Eldritch implicits on the helmet and body armor, and this portion of damage is mitigated with the aforementioned defensive layers for elemental damage. Then, unlike a lot of Gladiator builds in this patch, Goratha is not using blood magic, which means he's able to make use of Determination on top of Pride to provide a huge boost to armor. Base armor is being gained from the hybrid armor and evasion gear in combination with Iron Reflexes, which converts evasion rating into armor. And on top of all that armor is a bunch of additional physical damage reduction, which stacks additively with the reduction provided by armor against physical hits, up to the cap of 90%. There's 8% additional PDR gained from the body armor, another 8% from the Watcher's Eye Jewel due to Determination, and a further 24% from the 6 endurance charges, for a total of 40% raw physical damage reduction without armor, which also applies to any physical damage over time that the character would be taking. Speaking of physical damage over time, Goratha is using the Ralakesh Pantheon to ensure that bleeding and corrupted blood is pretty much a non-factor. Lastly, for damage type specific mitigation, we have Chaos damage, and whilst this version of the build doesn't quite have capped Chaos resistance, it does have capped Chaos resistance against any Chaos damage over time, such as Poison or Chaos Ground degens, thanks to the Soul of Arakali major Pantheon power, which provides plus 40% to Chaos resistance against damage over time. And we should discuss damage over time and recovery generally, because it's typically something that non-Slayer duelist builds struggle with a lot. Goratha is using Vitality and is also gaining a bit more life regen from the Vitality Watcher's Eye Jewel modifier. There's also a bunch of Tugo Harmer Shaman tattoos being used for some percentage-based life regeneration too. Then we have the Damage Over Time Mastery that's being taken for 10% less damage taken from damage over time, and the aforementioned Arakali Pantheon power also grants 10% reduced damage taken from damage over time. And on top of that, the build has access to Life Leech, and of course, the life recovery on block in cases where hits are being taken as well as damage over time. Lastly, for the build's defenses, we have Fortify. Goratha is using the good old Fortify support gem in the Eviscerate main damage link, and despite this being a bleed build, the skill hits really hard, ensuring maximum Fortify stacks are able to be maintained for 20% less damage taken from all incoming hits. And that's just about all of it. Goratha's Eviscerate Bleed Gladiator build. I really wanted to cover this one in the build overview series because it's using a lot of new mechanics that were added in 3.25, and I think it makes great use of them. Goratha actually made a full build guide for this build which was released a few days ago while I was making this video, so I'm going to link that video in the description below, and I recommend checking that out if you want to play the build, because there's some great information in the video, and the PoB that's linked in that video is packed full of good advice right from the point of leveling the character at the very beginning. And that's going to be it for this one. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your ongoing support. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.